This is a story about building a house and how that momentous event happened. The video and photos we shot during construction have been sitting on a shelf in my office for almost 10 years now. Like a time capsule, they needed to be opened. It brought everything back into focus. The month after month of construction that we went through for the better part of 2 years, and the little things that we had forgotten. Now, after a decade has passed and the sounds of saws and hammers have receded, we still reflect on all the events that took place along the way and the people that worked here and made it happen. It all started many years ago at a cabin on a lake. My mother Margaret and her husband Bob bought the cabin as a summer retreat to get away from their busy lives in Vancouver. Our first visits to the lake were short, as we lived in San Francisco, but even for those few days, it was a magical place. There was just something about a cabin on a lake in the summer. The years flew by as they tend to do. We moved my mother and Bob from their home in Vancouver into a townhouse in Parksville, not far from the summer cabin. A few years later, Bob passed away, and as a result, we ended up spending more and more time at the cabin to be with my mom. After living in San Francisco in an apartment for over 30 years, we were starting to talk about a change of life and what that might look like. We were also aware that my mother was aging and that we were the only ones left for her to depend on. The reality of the situation kicked in, and we started seriously considering leaving San Francisco and moving to the island. The only problem was the cabin. It was summer charming, but not suitable as a year-round home. After a lot of discussion, it all boiled down to a simple choice: sell the lake property or rebuild and live there permanently. It was probably the biggest decision we had ever faced, and not one that we could put off for much longer. So in our case, the universe unfolded as it should. We seized the moment and started the planning to build a new house. We knew the day was coming, but I don't know if we were actually ready for it. It was fairly shocking to see something you've maintained over the years totally destroyed.
It was so loud and violent. Total destruction. All those old memories were gone in an instant. It happened way faster than I thought it would.
By the end of the day, it was done. Just rubble. Hauled off in a few truckloads to the dump. Excavation started as soon as the last of the house debris was hauled away. That was one of the things that caught me off guard, just how fast everything happens. The first project was the installation of the septic tanks that would be buried underground. It was also the start of a continuous parade of trucks and cranes and all sorts of heavy equipment roaming around the property.
Perfect.
Neither of us had been around a construction site before, so it took some time to get used to it. We'd decided to be on site most days for the entire building project.
We come this way just a little bit right. About 4 inches.
There were always questions that would come up, and decisions had to be made.
I was thinking we'd take this in here.
The relationship between homeowner and contractor can be a real balancing act. Once you've made the decision to go ahead, you have to be able to stand back and let them do their work. The excavation continued for a couple of days, until the ground had been scraped away to bedrock and the extra fill hauled away from the site. Now we had a great big hole in the ground. As soon as the excavation was finished, it started to rain, unusual for the middle of July. And then it kept raining. Our framing crew took over and began the layout for the footings and perimeter of the house, which was roughly a 42-foot by 42-foot square.
We had planned to document the entire building project on video and with still photos. I felt sorry for them working down there all day in the mud. We barely knew their names at this point, but we'd be together day after day for the next year through all kinds of weather. The main thing is that our project had begun, and it was exciting to see something being built.
You start to realize that most of what goes into a structure, all the drainage pipes and plumbing and miles of rebar and PVC, all disappears. Each level in the process is like that. Build it out and then cover it all over. The transformation from one stage to the next is always dramatic. Everything would now be buried under tons of drain rock, filling up the excavation to the top of the concrete footings. It was time to get ready for the main event, the foundation pour. For several days, the crew had built out the forms, bracing them to withstand the pressure and weight of the tons of concrete they'd have to contain. No room for error here. A blowout in a form would be disastrous. The walls are reinforced with heavy-gauge steel rebar and sit on top of the previously poured footings that will support the entire weight of the structure.
They move together like a team, balanced up there on the walls. They didn't move fast. They moved with purpose from one task to another. That's the reality of their work. The pace is important. That's what gets you through each day to the next, over the long haul. After the concrete was cured and they stripped the forms away, the transformation was revealed. Smooth, gray concrete foundation walls.
The rear walls are coated in sealant and then covered with foundation wrap to prevent any moisture migrating into the concrete. Thick poly sheeting is laid over the drain rock and is then topped by insulation panels and a steel mesh. When we started planning the house, we did a lot of research into using in-floor radiant heat.
Yeah.
On paper, it's a fairly straightforward system.
Want to go back a little further? I'll take this one. Just about 10 feet.
Warm water under low pressure circulates through the PEX tubing coils and heats separate zones in the concrete flooring of the house, and each zone can be controlled by its own thermostat. The great thing about radiant is that it's totally quiet, unlike forced air, and produces a uniform heat that literally radiates upwards from the floor. The layout has to conform very precisely to the floor plans to locate areas where the subfloor framing will be attached.
Yeah. So we're going to come out clear off that mark 48 and back. Yeah.
One screw or drill bit in the wrong place could rupture the PEX. After they're covered over, the safe areas to drill can only be located using the plans. The whole system is pressurized much higher than its normal operational level to ensure there are no leaks before and during the final concrete slab pour. It's a relatively simple design, but the installation requires contractors who really know what they're doing. It takes the rest of the day to finish pouring and smoothing the 2,000 square foot slab that covers the perimeter drains, the drain rock, the plumbing, the insulation, and all the heating coils under 5 inches of concrete.
Put that 6-footer, we'll work our way out again.
It was such an amazing transformation to watch. You go through all the layers of work to get to this point, and then truckload after truckload of wet cement covers it all up. Then the concrete slowly hardens, and the crew starts working it over and over until it's this perfect, smooth, flat gray surface. And then that part is over. It will cure over the weekend, and on Monday they'll start framing.
Within a couple of days, the framing starts to take shape. This part seems to go really fast. For the first time, we're starting to see the dimensions of the rooms and the windows and doorways in the lower level. It's a huge shift mentally to go from the years of drawing and planning to actually seeing the physical form take shape. When we were designing the house, we knew we wanted 9-foot ceilings in the flat areas. We definitely did not want the feeling of a basement. The rear of the house, where the laundry and mechanical rooms are located, is mostly underground, but the slope falls away as we approach the lakeside. The lower bedrooms are on grade, opening to the patio and yard. I could see the building crew really settling into a rhythm. They like framing. One guy measures, one guy cuts, hit it with a nail gun, bring out more wood, and keep it going. There's a real satisfaction in seeing that progress. Building a house here in the rainforest is a whole different ballgame than building on a town lot. It rains a lot here. In the winter months, it can come down for weeks without a break. We're on a sloped acre of mainly grass and garden. When you build a house in the path of all that water, you have to intercept it and divert it away from the foundation. That's where drain rock comes in. The house is surrounded by large perforated perimeter drains. The first step in the backfill is to cover the drainage area below the foundation with a couple of feet of drain rock that allows the water to seep through without pooling. We eventually lost count of how many truckloads of drain rock went into the foundation as the hole disappeared. The guys who operate all this industrial machinery are so good at it. They can sculpt and redesign the landscape with a twitch of the hand using the power of hydraulics.
Don't touch the plants. Don't touch them.
It's amazing to watch. After a while, it just seems normal to have trucks coming and going and excavators and bobcats constantly on the move, surrounding you. By August, framing for the lower level was almost finished, but that's also when the scope of the project expanded and seemed to kick into high gear. We were about to start work on a second building that would become Deborah's art studio. It was a relatively simple structure, 30 by 20 feet with a peaked roof, built on a foundation and insulated slab. But it still had to be started like all the rest of it, from scratch. Coordinating all of the construction activities was a real balancing act, and we were lucky to have a contractor with the kind of depth of knowledge and skill that could keep everything on track, even though at times it seemed chaotic. The crew would split up. A couple would work on prepping the studio for the foundation, while the others continued with the main house. At the same time, contractors were digging water lines and trenches for the septic lines and burying electrical cables for the underground wiring.
inches. Then you're gonna have a pretty small strip down here. 4 inches.
The work progressed, slowly, steadily every day, and by mid-August, everyone started to really hit their stride. Maybe it was the days starting to get shorter or the coolness in the morning air. The reality of fall weather just around the corner was on everyone's mind. Engineering technology has changed the way houses get built in radical ways. Traditional wood framing is augmented with engineered lumber products designed for very specific uses, like the I-joist system for floor construction. In our case, they were the perfect solution for long spans because of their light weight and incredible performance in supporting heavy loads. Structural engineers created the I-joist, but they still have to be installed the old-fashioned way, by skilled carpenters, and ours proved to be really good at it.
Kind of there. Okay, yeah. Okay, ready to stand it?
Pull it. Okay. Pull it your way. Hold up. Okay, go. About a couple inches.
Right there.
Perfect.
As the last days of August approached, the building process seemed to splinter into a lot of different tasks, all happening at once. There was a definite sense of urgency to get things done and build out the house before the weather changed. We still had a long way to go. The studio foundation forms were prepped and ready for concrete. The main floor joists were covered with subfloor plywood and ready for the plumbers to start work on the radiant heat installation. The coils were looped continuously through each designated zone, like the master bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom, and then returned to the standing manifold, and then back down to the boiler in the mechanical room. Like the floor below, the heat would be controlled by individual thermostats for each zone. All of this activity was the prelude to the next main event. A full day of pouring truck after truck of concrete, starting with the studio foundation walls.
I was really excited to see them start working on my studio. I think every artist has a vision in mind for what their space might be. Knowing it was mine and watching them build that dream was very special.
By midday, the studio foundation was finished, and the crew moved on to the entry portico. Finally, it was all hands on deck for the big pour on the main floor, where the plumbers had so meticulously laid out the radiant coils that would now be embedded in concrete.
Here we go again. Another pour. What a scene. Up to their boots in concrete, faces and arms splattered. It was a really hot day and they had to work fast before the concrete started to set. Everyone was going at it, pulling the screeds back and forth, leveling it all out with the floats and trowels. A real team effort.
By the end of the day, we had made huge progress. The main slab would be ready to start with framing, the studio had a foundation, the portico foundation was poured, and everything would be solid in the morning as the concrete hardened. And all the effort and labor that led up to this midpoint in construction would carry on day after day as the crew arrived every morning ready to go at it again and take on the next task.
Ready?
Not me, but I'll help you.
Push.
Okay. One more and I'm yours, it's all mine.
Push.
Ready?
Push.
Nice. Okay. Fingers there. Okay.
You got her there for a minute?
And pull it towards me.
Okay.
Okay, I
Down.
just, you just say when, stop.
Down.
Yeah.
We're there.
Okay. Now it's gonna take some talent.
Yeah.
It took some serious effort to get the 15-foot 8x8 cedar posts in place. They would eventually support the load of the upper concrete deck. The studio subfloor was backfilled with sand to cover the underground wiring, and would then be compacted and prepped for a concrete slab. After the deck posts were secured, the crew started framing in the floor joists that would support the curved concrete deck looking out over the lake. And of course, more drain rock to bury the main electrical lines and the perimeter drains connecting the studio to the main house.
By mid-September, the studio slab was ready to be poured. More concrete. We finally figured out why the crew liked pouring concrete so much. There was a finality to it, an end game to all the labor they put into building the forms and cutting rebar and compacting. By morning, it would be a solid surface ready to frame. We were lucky. The September weather was perfect. The studio framing was moving right along. This was the first time that I could actually see the structure and get a feeling for the space. It was like, wow, this is really something.
Our contractor decided on a laminated ridge beam for the studio roof. These beams eliminate a lot of the problems that solid wood beams tend to have, like twisting or splitting as they dry out. They're machine made, so they stay straight and they're actually stronger than traditional solid lumber.
Most days I had a fire or two going. It was actually my job, as our contractor agreed to knock off some money from our budget for debris removal if I would do it. It was incredible how much scrap wood there was after a day of building. By late September, the guys had made really good progress on the studio, and now they were starting to put the trim on the fascia boards. They were always so precise on the details. Real craftsmen.
The day the roof trusses arrived on a very long flatbed truck was stressful. It had been raining, the driveway was muddy, there was barely enough room for the truck to get down. The crane operator had to lift the longest spans that would form the ridge peak of the roof into place through the trees and up onto the walls, so the crew could attach bracing to hold them in place. It was a delicate balancing act.
You need boom in? We've got to boom in. Closer. I still got to go over.
Then it was bundle after bundle of trusses, up and through the trees and onto the main floor.
Huh?
Gotta go that way more.
Go that way a bit.
It ended up taking most of the day just to unload. The roof trusses are engineered frames of lumber joined together in triangular shapes with galvanized steel connector plates. Their high strength to weight ratio allows for long spans without the need for intermediate support, and are well suited for the kind of open floor plan we had designed.
Yeah, get him through.
The carpenters really like working with them because they eliminate a lot of on-site framing problems. They're CAD designed for consistent accuracy and quality control.
Say when, Will? That's good. Okay, ready? Yeah.
They're numbered and assembled into a custom plan for the roof, so there's no cutting, and that makes the framing a lot faster than conventional roof structures.
It was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. It's kind of disorienting because you're looking at the roof structure in 3 dimensions with all these triangles. It was a real workout for the guys. They were up and down on the ladders, climbing around through the maze. They seemed to be enjoying it though, solving the puzzle.
Don't shoot me.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Sand, sand, and more sand. Truckload after truckload of sand. Not just any sand. This had to be a special wash sand, as defined by the building code for septic field construction. This is what happens when you build in the country, away from simple things like sewer lines. Here's how it works. You flush the toilet and that ends up in the first tank that's buried underground at the other end of the property near the lake. That tank overflows into the second tank, and then eventually into the third tank that has a submersible pump inside.
It's a bit better, yep.
The liquids are then pumped under pressure around 300 feet to the top of the property, where they are dispersed through a web of piping and valves into the sand, where they eventually evaporate. A major construction project just to flush a toilet. By the beginning of October, the trusses were finished, and it was time to start roofing. We'd been lucky so far. September had been mostly fair weather, but the fall rainy season was closing in. We decided to go with a metal roof based on its durability in our climate. The heavy gauge steel is fed from a roll into the machine that forms and cuts each piece to length from measurements loaded into the computer. Speed was important at this point. The weather in October could change any day. With the roof on, we didn't have to worry as much about the approaching rainy season. The interior framing would stay dry, eliminating any concerns over water damage that could lead to mold and mildew issues. As the roofing progressed and with the weather holding, the crew decided to finish the portico entry floor. More concrete. The portico, sidewalks, and deck surfaces would all be finished as exposed aggregate. That involves waiting for the concrete to cure just enough so that the top layer of cement can be washed away, exposing the pebbles for the finished surface. With the colder weather, it was taking a lot longer to cure. The roofing went really fast thanks to the cut-to-order capabilities of the machine and a great crew. Half of the main roof was on, and the studio roof was finished. By evening, the concrete on the portico was cured enough to start the wash-off to expose the aggregate. All in all, a very productive day.
By late October, we were well on our way with the interior framing. We had a very long to-do list for things like plumbing, fixtures, and tiles for the showers, decisions about lighting and kitchen cabinets, sinks and countertops. It was all about timing to make sure everything was ready for the different contractors.
And then there were the windows. We had 23 windows and doors, aluminum clad with pine interiors, ordered from Marvin. And then one day in October, they all arrived in a large truck. From the beginning, I had planned to do the interior painting myself, so now we turned the studio into a painting shop. The interiors were milled pine, and they were going to get the full treatment. First a white stain, followed by 3 coats of satin cetal, with a light sanding between coats, and then 1 more coat after installation, times 23 windows and doors. I definitely had my work cut out for me.
That winter was really tough. We had a lot of snow and it stuck around. By this time, we'd been at it for about 7 months, and fatigue was setting in. Terry had finished the windows and doors, and they were all in except for the front door. We didn't want to risk damaging it until construction was over. The house was insulated and the heat was on, so that was a big plus, because the concrete floors were nice and warm. I just remember how quiet it was, especially when the guys were off for the weekend.
By mid-March, we had reached that all-important milestone known in the trades as lockup. 8 long months had passed since we started, but now the windows and doors were in, the siding was mostly complete, the heat was on, the water was running, and we were well on our way to the finish line.
Start feeling the heat down a little bit.
Now that the bulk of the work had shifted to the interior, we started to feel what the house was like inside as an enclosed space. There was a huge satisfaction completing each task. We had 4,000 square feet of walls to paint, floors to tile, bathrooms to finish, cabinets and counters to install. But there was something about everything being new. Everything was being done for the first time. The days were starting to get longer as well, leaving the darkness of winter behind us. We had planned to put off the stairs and sidewalk construction until summer, but it was getting so muddy around the house, we couldn't stand it any longer. We went ahead with 1 more concrete pour to get us out of the muck. It was one of those spring days that looked a lot like winter. Not the greatest working conditions, but at least the job would be finished.
We really hated the mud. It was one of those unforeseen things that could drive you crazy. The The sidewalks and portico were almost like the frosting on the cake, cleaning up all the edges around the house. I felt for the guys working outside all day in those conditions. But they never complained. They just kept at it day after day.
Spring seemed to take forever that year. The mornings were still cold, but at least it was dry, and that helped keep the mud at bay. We were down to just our core crew, who were finishing off the siding, as well as specialty subcontractors, like stonemasons and cabinet makers. After so many months of heavy equipment and all the workers coming and going, there was a great sense of peace and quiet that settled in over the house. By mid-June, the contractors were gone, and we spent the rest of the summer finishing the house. A year of construction had taken its toll on what was once our beautiful garden and yard. We had to bring in new topsoil and re-landscape, and then hydroseed most of the yard. In the end, we spent the better part of 2 years building. It was by far the biggest project we'd ever undertaken. Reflecting back now 10 years later, I'm still amazed by the amount of effort it took to make it happen. We'd like to send out a heartfelt thanks to all of the contractors, carpenters, and crew that showed up every day and worked so tirelessly to build our house.